Welcome to Hour 2, the 27th book in the Globalism book series. 27. On Living in a Revolution. This was written in 1942. And we have a series of essays, a series of pieces that deal with similar topics to what we saw in part 1 of this talk, the UNESCO philosophy. But we're going to branch out and we're going to talk about some other topics, some broader issue areas. Since this is part 2, we're only going to be covering the first 100 pages of this book and then the next Julian Huxley talk, because of course he is very important in the Globalism book series amongst the pantheon of globalists. So it's like Bertrand Russell, who got 2 books. We're going to do 2 Huxley. Maybe even some more Julian essays after this, because the next talk will be public and it'll be part of this book, and then I'll do a sequel to that one, which will be maybe some of his other essays or one of his rationalistic treatises. Now, as we saw in part 1, evolution is not just a theory about man's origins. It's an all-encompassing metaphysical principle that deals with everything. Everything is under this cosmic scope, galactic, cosmic, to the origin of man's, the origin of the universe, and to the omega point at the end of the universe, when man transcends and becomes one with machine. Again, this is who coined the term transhumanism. In this entire process, we are moving towards in the midst, of perpetual, never-ending evolution. Now, what's ironic, of course, is that the proposition, everything is changing, somehow, magically, is not changing. So, as you can see, from the outset, it is philosophically nonsense and contradictory. But that's okay, because he is not too concerned with that. He will invoke logic and reason quite often, but it doesn't matter what those things actually are, or if there is the possibility of such things in this worldview. He's, like Bertrand Russell, a propagandist. And what I want to stress here is, you'll notice that for being supposedly the smartest men in the world, the most brilliant, the best people, all right, this is the top of the food chain, supposedly, in the social Darwinian Royal Society Atlanticist sphere, they are fundamentally stupid. They're fundamentally unable to write a chapter without contradicting themselves. Not only that, they can't even write anything interesting or unique amongst themselves. They all write the exact same stuff. They all cite one another. So they pad themselves by citing each other, and it gives it the appearance of scholarly predictive power. Evolution is, in fact, a totality worldview in which everything is subject to the process of perpetual, never-ending change. Is it? How do you know that? Because this is grounded, as he'll argue in a later chapter, on bare empiricism, just mere examination of phenomena, events in the natural world. How does that tell you that everything is in that process? Because you never reach a universal, you never reach an all-encompassing universal claim by experience. So that is a dogma. But I thought you were interested in destroying dogmas. Again, we see how easily this breaks down. The revolution, he says, that I'm concerned with is the revolution of revolutions. It involves progress. Now, he's going to say progress probably 100 times in this book. Right? We're never told what it is or why it is or what the basis for it is. We're just told that it is, and it has something to do perhaps with beings becoming more and more complex through evolution, supposedly. Although we don't know why that itself is progress. Why would a being becoming more complex, which is, of course, contradictory to the notion that it's all nonsense and chaos, it immediately invokes design, of course. But on what basis is something having more and more molecules attached to it, more and more atoms, quote, progress. The revolution, he says, that everything is tending towards is what's called the revolution of revolutions. It is the final revolution. He says previous revolutions suffered from idealism all the way back, guess what, to the French Revolution. What do you hear me always going back to? French Revolution. You could go back to scientific revolution, doesn't matter. League of Nations, he says, all of these entities that were revolutionary in their nature, in their function, in their bylaws, and in their rise, suffered from idealisms, he says, but we in our revolution will not suffer from these same flaws of previous revolutions, because our revolution, he says, unlike all the previous ones, is based on scientific pragmatism and naive empiricism. He says it is in ways socialistic, but of course it's not socialistic in the sense of a totalitarian dictatorship. So in his mind, he's going to try to make this case throughout this really boring book that totalitarianism is the wrong way to approach the New World Order. He says if totalitarianism wins, because again, he's writing at 1942, right? World War II has not ended. He says if it doesn't succeed, democracy doesn't succeed, there's going to be a world government either way. It doesn't matter whether it's democracy that wins or fascism, the Axis powers. He says either one is going to be a manifestation of the revolution, and it's going to produce the revolutionary technocratic end goal. Now, he wants it to be the democratic Western Atlanticist capitalist that becomes socialist approach. So he's very critical of laissez-faire, very critical of Adam Smith, very critical of the libertarian individualist ethos, but he's not critical on the basis of any kind of reasoning that we would make as orthodox or as counter-revolutionary. He's critical just on the basis of the fact that it's not technocratic. It's not based on scientific regimentation. He says it's not going to matter what people do because it's all a part of the process, and the transference from capitalism to socialism is part of the process. Now, that doesn't mean that socialism, in the sense of a totalitarian dictatorship in his mind, is the solution. The socialism that's going to come will maximize freedom, right? This is what Huxley says in Brave New World. That's why Huxley said this. Accept the revolution, he says, and if you don't, then you're going to miss out. It's inevitable. You can't fight this revolution, he says. He says the key foundational doctrine. I thought we were freeing ourselves from doctrines. Well, the key foundational doctrine of this worldview is scientism, and that is the end of chapter of the preface. That's preface 1. Basic scientific empiricism. Everything Bertrand Russell told us. He says there are phases and there are keys to the world revolution, and the world revolution is global. And he says once you realize that, you're not going to be caught up in any specific revolution. You're not going to be caught up in Bolshevism or fascism or Marxism or capitalism. You're going to realize that it doesn't really matter which one of these tools is at play, because it's taken us to the same end goal. And that same end goal, he says, is the ultimate subjugation of economics to the social, that is, to the collective, planning and central management, right? Burnham, central planning, managerial society, social integration and cultural unity, and an international government. That's where it's all going. Next, he says, during this present World War II, he says wartime will allow for the experimentation on how to regiment societies, because you can get a lot more done in wartime than you can in so-called peacetime. So there's phases to the world revolution, and he lists several of them that lead eventually to the end goal of the final revolution and post-humanism. All of the revolutions, all the way back to, you could go back to French Revolution, he says, all the way up through the Russian Revolution, all the way up through to the revolution of scientism. He says they're all one revolution. Exactly what the essay at the beginning of Brave New World says. These are all the same revolutions. And there you'll see beautiful, lovely Julian there. The greatest, these are the greatest, highest people that exist on the planet, as this little slug man there. He says that thanks to the efforts of guys like Wendell Willkie and Walter Lippmann, people are being initiated into the collectivist idea. Now, we remember that Walter Lippmann, of course, was a OSS guy with Bill Donovan. And that doesn't mean that he was a communist in the OSS. No, the point is that they're going to get us to the technocratic managerial society, just like Miles Copeland says, and it doesn't matter which road you take to the end goal. There's 4 different roads you could take. Take them all, it doesn't matter, because it's all going to the same end goal. That's why in Brave New World, characters are named after both capitalists and communists. Bernard Marx, Ford, right? People have Ford and Marx. The year of our Ford. The age of social man is going to replace the age of Homo economicus. Homo economicus being man determined by economic theory. Right? I mean, Spangler talked about this, Homo economicus. And capitalism has all these problems, he says, and so it's going to move us to the age of social man, because it's going to eventually be clear that capitalism is not sustainable because it leads to monopoly capitalism. And he says we're already seeing in the U.S. experiments in large-scale social planning like the New Deal and the TVA, which is the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was connected to Oak Ridge, and the creation of atom bomb. He says all that was done by large-scale central planning, and shows that it can produce results in a superior way, he says, in this managerial way, than the free enterprise competition way. He says that the end goal on page 10 is a new world order, and H.G. Wells wrote about this. Well, of course, because they're all in the same circles. He says that what it will lead to is a managerial society focused around technological and scientific efficiency. It's not going to be about freedom. It's not going to be about your decisions to choose what you want to be when you grow up. It's going to be about the collective good, whatever that is. We're never told. They're going to tell us. And efficiency, technocratic scientific efficiency. He says that warfare in wartime allows for a much easier excuse to get through large-scale social experiments and social change. Exactly. Yes, Alan Watt talks about this often. He says the control of dictators isn't all bad because they do get things done. He says one thing we have to admit about the dictators, the communist dictators, the fascist dictators, he says they're all sons of the revolution, and they all get the work done. It's efficient. But he says, let's hope that it's a democratic revolution that we get. And if you read Brave New World, it's not a friendly democratic revolution. It's like, we don't want Hitler, but we want the same idea of a control system. We just want the control system to be, with a lot of sex and a lot of drugs, right? So the atomized individual has to go away. He's used to things like voting. This is all nonsense, and it has to go away. And he says that we've seen the breakdown of the collective at the time of the revolutions, the rise of capitalism, the rise of laissez-faire. He says that led to the rise of the individual and the breakdown of the old order. And he says that now that we've broken down the old order, we can reconstruct everything back into the proper collective that it needs to be. So you have this breaking down of the old order, the collapse of the existing unifying structures, church and state at that time. The nation state, he says, has to go. And then when it's all disintegrated, it can be reconstructed and rebuilt into the new man. So a manipulation of the one and the many. And he says that we will have to integrate the principles of democracy into our technocratic utopia, because it will have to be based on liberty, equality, and fraternity. Oh, wait a minute. That's Masonic. Yes, exactly. Of course it is. And it's Masonic back to the French Revolution. Now, he says, however, there's going to be limits on this. It's not going to mean freedom in like the American sense. I'm not saying American freedoms are good or bad. You can have your view on that. I'm just saying, in Huxley's mind, he's saying that the point is where we're going. Liberty, equality, and fraternity are going to be given an important role, but they're going to define what that means according to scientific socialism. He says it's time to get rid of all competition. Competition is useless. And why is there competition? Because there's differences among people. So we have to erase all the distinctions amongst people groups, because that's the reason nations have wars. People fight one another. Well, it's not, of course. It's because of sin. It's not because there are distinctions and differences. But if you are a monist and if you are a atheist, as he is, or a Luciferian, then the idea of wiping out all distinctions and creating a giant Babel makes perfect sense on their worldview. He says it's time for the West to give up their presuppositions of superiority on the basis of logic and government and laws, and he says accept the relativism of the Far East. He says there's no better status of the West as opposed to communist China. Literally, he says that on page 17. Isn't that interesting? Because that's exactly what David Rockefeller says in his 1973 or 1979 New York Times editorial from a China traveler. So again, the same power structure, whether it's Huxley in 42 or Rockefeller in 79, they're saying the exact same thing. All of these systems are just systems of control. He says that we don't really need to worry about this master race idea that's going to go away. He says he hopes. He doesn't seem 100% positive that the axes are going to lose, but he doesn't think that idea is going to be successful, because as we saw in the other book that we covered in part 1, as we saw there, we don't need to have the idea of one master race. We need a more of a Fabian socialist model of let's just pick the top percentile out of each race. That's better for science anyway. And he says that the end goal is world peace. We'll have world peace if we just follow my 10 easy steps to world peace. Really? Is that really how it's going to work? And he says the more that we have these kind of peace charters and UN-based charters for the nations, he says that's going to, gradually, step by step, take us to the goal of world peace. We'll get rid of war. He says, and it's logical. This is the logical evolutionary step and outworking that leads us through historical phases to the final revolution and perfect technocracy. So here you see with the aspects where they do find commonality with Karl Marx. But it's a mistake to think that they're just simply adopting Marxism. There's aspects of Marxism. But just like H.G. Wells said, when we covered 2 different H.G. Wells books, actually we've covered more than 2, but if you count Island of Dr. Moreau and the fiction, but if we're just looking at Open Conspiracy and New World Order from H.G. Wells, if we remember, he said very clearly that you dumb communists, it's only capitalism that will have the power to bring the global infrastructure for the global government, not communism. So the system that comes is neither capitalist nor communist. It's elements of both. That's the whole point. But as long as all of these goofy people are caught up in the dialectic of Marxism versus capitalism, they will never, ever figure this out. He goes on to say, we live in a revolutionary age, and the age of economic man, of laissez-faire. That's the predominant organizing principle that mankind and civilization has operated under since the time of the scientific revolution, Enlightenment. that's going to lead to socialized man. The organic society of the future, ideas like freedom of speech, freedom of movement, these are going to be subjected to the collective good, he says. The final revolution is technocratic and it is atheistic. And he says that older ideas like the existence of a nation or different people groups or the divine right or anything to do with theology affecting government, he says is long dead. All long dead. The new order is atheistic and scientific. He says it's not going to be based around the attainment of wealth or capital. That itself was just a phase of revolution. We're moving beyond that. So this is a revolution of the revolution of the revolution of the revolution. The society of the future, the wave of the future, as he keeps calling it, will be constructed in terms of holism, collective groupings. And he goes on to say, we already have this idea when we look at the fact that there are clubs, there are unions, the nation state itself is a kind of collective grouping. Corporations, corporatism, he says this already exists, but it leads to the freedom that exists leads to corporatism. And since corporatism neglects things like the environment, which actually controls the environment, and the people who set up Julian's UN, like the Rockefellers, are the biggest corporatists on the earth. So this is a scam, keep in mind. But he's right to say that corporatism leads to all of this, to a lot of problems. Absolutely. But his solution is not anything to do with God, anything to do with forsaking the wickedness of these systems. It's rather to build a new order, and he says base it around massive regulations. Shocker, page 25. And he says this will be done through the manipulation of the one and the many. We can look at the way the military functions to get an example, to get an insight into the type of extreme efficiency that needs to come into play here. And here you see there's some book he wrote the introduction to, dealing with massively reducing population in India. Military and technological models of efficiency will be kind of the norm for all of society. So there's aspects of Marx there, but there's also aspects of corporate planning and the corporate state. So it's corporate Marxism with a liberal social theory, right? Because having the family and having property and all that kind of stuff, that's still not degenerate enough. If they can actually make you just totally degenerate, which is what you get in the system that's coming into fruition throughout the world right now in our real world, it's a much easier system for controlling people. And that's actually what Huxley says. Aldous, if you listen to the Berkeley lectures, he says this. Just give them a bunch of drugs and sex. That's a better way to control them and to sterilize them than to allow them some kind of fascistic system. So that's why there's a war against fascism, not because of the actual beliefs, and not even because they thought that fascism was somehow inherently bad or they really rejected it on principle. The only reason they don't want fascism is that they don't think it's a dark enough system. Then he goes into these other areas of propaganda that match up well with what he said in the UNESCO philosophy piece that we did in part 1. City planning, museums, the arts, all of it comes into play in the top-down control society, centrally planned society. Recreation and public services are all going to be combined. This is, he says, the New Deal of FDR, TVA. Those are models. Those are modeled very similar to the USSR, he says, which is a great experiment. The USSR is a socialistic outworking that is the ultimate answer, but not in that form. It'll just have to modify and evolve into the proper form in the future of blended East and West, third way type stuff. And just like Bertrand Russell, the Soviets were great. Why? Because they were an atheistic, scientific-based system. Now, he thinks ultimately the West has a better scientific system. But it doesn't really matter either way, whether communists or capitalists or the socialists or the Soviets win. It's all going to be the same system in the end. All the previous revolutions, he says, are leading to this. And he says even the revolutions that led to nationalism were just preparatory to bring about the revolution globally for the nation state in the modern sense, not the nation state of 2,000 years ago, right? Not ancient Greece, but the revolution, the idea of the modern nation state after the French Revolution would then lead to the eventual revolution of the New World Order. Nation state and nationalism is bound up with the attainment of capital, of national banks, of wealth, and private property. And he says, of course, that all has to go because it's all slated for the dustbin. He says the entire notion of the old order, everything prior to the Enlightenment, has got to be done away with. And he says it doesn't matter whether it's the revolutions in 1917 in Russia, or whether it's revolutions that took place in Italy and Turkey and China and Germany and Spain and Portugal and France, America, whatever. All of these revolutions, he says, are part of one global revolution. He says the League of Nations was a nice little phase in this process, but it wasn't enough. And so the Second World War is going to prepare for the United Nations. Right? And this is the guy who's the brains behind it. Rockefeller and Company, Rothschild and Company, they put up the money. And Julian and Aldous are the brains behind this nonsense. Now he goes on to talk about the pros and the cons of these different systems. There's some pros and there's some cons to the socialists and to the communists and the fascists, the capitalists. He says that it doesn't really matter because in the end, it's all going to, again, to evolve into whichever one works the best. So that's why he says these systems are experiments, right? That's why Bertrand Russell can talk about the Soviet experiment. The United States is the Enlightenment experiment. In fact, he says, I love the changes that took place in Russia. Yes, the rejection of orthodoxy and the erection of atheism and many martyrs. That's the system he loves. The New World Order is a one world order that is destined to come. And he says it might be the Germans. The Germans might win and they might bring their New World Order. But he says, regardless, it's going to be a New World Order, but we hope that it's going to be one dominated by the United Nations and not just some Nordic group in 53. He says, no, what we want is a egalitarian, democratic New World Order. Based on what? On scientism. Now, the next section, he goes on to argue for his scientism, philosophy in a world at war. He says, what's the true philosophy that we should adopt? Scientism. Bare, naive, empiricism, and scientism. And he says this is set over against everything to do with God, metaphysics, Christianity. Well, of course it is, because it's a war on that. He says faith has nothing to do with reason. They're two different. This is, again, a false presupposition because, of course, his reason doesn't exist. It's not material because he's a rank materialist. And he goes on to say this. He says, I am a rank materialist. Scientism is absolutely certain. It's true. It's the only method of attaining knowledge. But he doesn't ever question that presupposition. He says, no, it's all settled. It's all certain. Darwin is true. Newton is true. And he says what Darwin is to biology, Newton was to physics. He says there aren't really distinctions. Everything is just matter, and everything ultimately is just one. So since everything is one, everything should just be a collective. I told you this. This is exactly what Aldous writes in Perennial Philosophy. And he says, I'm just a naive materialist because that's all there is. Because when he says when you look at a zygote or something like this, or when you look at cells, he says you don't actually see a soul, so there's no such thing as a soul. That's how stupid these people are. He says I don't see a soul under the microscope. When I cut open a brain, I don't see a mind. I just see gray matter. But he says it's only rational to hold this. Now, rational and logical? There's nothing rational and logical about materialism. It's refuted in 2 seconds. But he says life is just chemical reactions. It's meaningless. Oh, no, wait a minute. But you don't think your life is meaningless, Mr. Huxley. He says it's all just chaos and evolution that leads to the chance occurrences of accidental mutations helping one member of the species to become more fit. And he says this is progress. He says, we don't need any of this theology because he says everything is perfectly explained by Freud and Darwin. You can't make this up. Freud and Darwin. And he says those are perfectly scientific explanations for all of human drives. These clowns don't even believe in Freud. And Darwinism has been altered multiple times over. Now, he says, since God's not material, and since God's not observed, there's no reason to believe in theistic evolution. Now, he also acts like there's nothing that guides evolution. It's just chaos. And anything can happen. Now, wait a minute. If that's the case, then why does it appear that each species only codes genetically for that species? A bear doesn't ever start to print whale code. A whale doesn't ever print bear code, but he doesn't either. He didn't know that, or he was lying at this time, because he acts like it's all just chaos. Literally every different thing out there is chaos, but there's a guided progress going on. Progress doesn't come from chaos. That makes no sense. And then he talks, of course, about morals. He says, so if this is true in the evolutionary sphere, and if that's true if materialism is true, then obviously there aren't morals. Morals just evolve. Like everything else, morals are in a constant cosmic evolutionary process, because all that exists is just matter anyway. No one knows what's right or wrong. No one has any kind of answer like that. No one knows where the world came from or who created it. There is no knowledge of any of that, so just forget about it. But trust me that we're living in a period of great progress. And so then he moves on to discuss Darwinism at more length, because this is his religion. Right? I mean, he's the relative of T.H. Huxley, Darwin's bulldog. So these are the propagandists of the Royal Society who put this out. He says war comes not necessarily because of Darwinism and social progress, or social Darwinism. He said that could play into it, but war comes because people want to have private property. So social and economic Darwinism are there, but he says they're no hindrance to the creation of a world government, because it's not fundamental demand to have to go to war. And when we institute the world government, we'll have peace, because we'll put an end to that, and we can direct the impulses to have conflict and competition into meaningless things like sports. This is why sports and sports ball is so important. He says that it may sound utopian, but don't worry about it, because it's going to lead to world peace, and there's no reason why. He says people calling it utopian, they just don't get it, because there's no reason why we can't have utopia. Evolution in action. Look at that. All these books, man. This is their religion. Now, in the next chapter, he says Darwinism has not been critiqued or defeated. It never will. Oh, wait a minute. I thought it was a scientific theory. Sure is. You sure do treat it like a religious dogma. Because he does. Because everybody treats their presuppositions like religious dogmas, even if their presuppositions are atheism and materialism. And he talks about T.H. Huxley and how T.H. really got Darwinism going. Ernst Haeckel did the same thing in Europe. His family. And so, of course, naturally, his family, he wants credit for solving all the world's problems and having the greatest theory ever, supposedly. He talks about genetics and mutations, and he says that, well, what we figured out is that it may not be gradual like Darwin thought. So I guess he's getting at punctuated equilibrium type ideas, but he says there's just jumps, right? There's just these jumps that happen, and you get a new species. And species don't really, that's just human terms that we give to things that aren't really out there in the world. It's just a way to name things. But how do we get from whale to bear? Well, there's just jumps that happen. Now, there's not any fossils to back up millions of years of jumps, but don't worry about it. It just happens. How does it happen? Mutations. Random mutations somehow become beneficial. And we know this from breeding, right? Because if a mouse or if a butterfly is in a certain region, the butterfly might start to take on the color of its local surroundings. So therefore, there's a transmutation of species. Really? Has any of this been observed? No. But that's the only option. Oh, that's the only option, right? I mean, so what if it's? I mean, in other words, a mouse starting to have white hair over brown hair means that eventually a mouse mutates into what? I don't know, something else. But again, he is unaware or lying about the fact that the DNA of a mouse never starts to print the DNA code of a squirrel or of a cat or any other type of animal, which it would have to do. He says, well, we just look at the fact that there's a short-term diversification and variation among species in certain areas. Therefore, we can make the assumption that at some point there's a jump and they just kind of leap into being something. But now, wait a minute. I thought that, animals kind of have birth and give birth to that same kind of animal, don't they? Does a whale give birth to a bear? No. So what's the jump? Well, there's a jump in the sense that maybe one of the whale descendants starts to develop something that's more like a leg, and he gets kind of stranded on the earth or on land, and then he kind of moves around a little bit. Oh no! Wait a minute. How does a half whale or 1/8 whale, 1/8 mammal, begin to become a marsupial or begin to walk? Right. So it's just total nonsense. And then he cites other guys like JBS Haldane, another one of these Gnostic individuals. He says Darwin is again, he reaffirms this, Darwin is the Newton of biology. And this connects us, as we see, to the fact that it is coming down to us from the pipeline of the Royal Society. Right? I mean, the Royal Society is behind all of this, all the way back to Rademacher and the rise of paleontology as a science. Shocker, Rademacher was a Mason. T.H. Huxley, the first to really propose the transmutation of species, not Darwin. We're reading his relative here, Julian. We will eventually read T.H. because that book is pretty funny. No evidence, just woodcuts. What's the first evidence of this theory? Woodcuts that some guy saw somewhere. I saw a thing that kind of looked like it might be an intermediate species, like half monkey, half ape, baboon looking thing. Let me draw you a woodcut. Trust me, here's what it looked like. No, this is all nonsense theory. And again, nothing new here, nothing pioneering, nothing interesting, literally just rehashing all the other Darwinists, rehashing all the same points and arguments, pointing out it's a complete facade, pointing out that it's not a scientific theory, it's a grand cosmic metaphysical theory, at the same time as saying we don't do metaphysics anymore. No, you liar, you're doing it. Total contradiction. And it's not highbrow. It's not sophisticated and advanced. The stuff is all cookie cutter, boring tripe. They all just repeat each other, and they all just cite each other. Let me cite Mr. Wells. Let me cite Mr. Russell. Let me cite JBS Haldane. And JBS Haldane will cite all them. And they'll all cite Charles Galton Darwin. And Galton Darwin will cite all them. It's just an incestuous bunch of nonsense. And the Royal Society has foisted upon the entire world this stupid mythology of Darwinism. It is the dogma of the New World Order. It's never questioned. It's the basis of transhumanism. All of these so-called truthers never questioning this. This is the root of it. Anyway, all right, so that's the first half. That's the first 100 pages of this awful book. This is a nightmare book to read. Hope you appreciate it, guys. But thank you. And next we will do the second half public. And then after that, we'll do some more of his essays for you subscribers. Thank you, guys. God bless. Thank you for your patience and waiting for me to finally get this done. But again, I know it sounds a little repetitive, but these are the people that engineered the modern world. And they're not that smart. They're really not. So don't feel inferior to these degenerates. God bless, and I will talk to you soon.